I buried my husband 20 years ago. His name was Miles Kane. We called him our rock, our safe harbor. He was 38 when the sedan he was driving went off the cliffside pass during a November rainstorm in 2005. They told me the car had hydroplaned, crashed through the guardrail, and plunged into the ravine below. 5 people died that night. Miles was one of them. I identified his body at the morgue in Salem, Oregon. I was 41 years old, and I had to tell our daughter Alicia that her father was never coming home. Before I go on, tell me, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? It's past 1 a.m. here, the same hour my whole world changed. If you're new here, tap that like button, subscribe, and stay until the end, because what I'm about to tell you still doesn't make sense, even to me. Last Thursday, my phone rang at 1:03 in the morning. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was 206, Seattle. I almost didn't answer. At 61, you learn that nothing good comes from calls at that hour, but something made me reach for it. Maybe it was the same instinct that used to wake me when Alicia had nightmares as a child. I answered. A voice said, "Clara? Is this Clara?" I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly pounding against my ribs. The voice was rough, uncertain, like someone who hadn't spoken in a very long time. But underneath that roughness, there was something that made my blood run cold. "Who are you?" I asked. There was breathing on the other end, heavy, labored. "It's me. It's Miles," the voice said. I dropped the phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick it up again. When I did, the line was still open. I could hear him breathing. "This isn't funny," I said, my voice cracking. "Whoever you are, this is sick. My husband died 20 years ago." I know how long it's been. I just figured out who I am. I found something, a newspaper article about the crash, and there's a picture of me, but the name under it says Miles Kane. That's me, isn't it? I'm Miles Kane. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. "Where are you?" I managed to say. I don't really know. A place called the Rainier District? Someone told me that's what it's called. I've been here a long time. I think I live in a shelter on South Jackson Street, but I don't remember. I don't remember how I got here. I don't remember anything before about 15 years ago, just waking up in a hospital and they said I'd been found on the street and I didn't have any ID, and I couldn't tell them my name. My mind was racing. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of scam. Someone who'd found Miles's name somewhere and decided to torture me with it. "What do you remember?" I asked, testing him. "Nothing clear, just feelings. Sometimes I dream about rain, about being cold, about metal twisting. And sometimes I dream about a house with red curtains, and someone used to make hot chocolate with cinnamon every Sunday morning." I felt the tears start then, hot and sudden, because I remembered those curtains. I remembered those Sunday mornings, and I remembered Miles always adding extra cinnamon, saying it made everything taste like home. And Alicia would always ask for 2 marshmallows instead of 1. "What do you look like?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Old." And there was something like sadness in his voice. "Really old. My face is, I don't know how to describe it, weathered, I guess. I've lived rough for a long time. But I found this picture in the newspaper from the accident, and even though it's 20 years old, I can see it. I can see myself in that face. We have the same eyes. Miles had a scar on his right hand from when he cut it fixing the garage door when Alicia was 3. 7 stitches. There was a long pause. Then I have a scar on my right hand. It's old. Really old. I never knew where it came from. I was crying now. Really crying in a way I hadn't cried since the day we buried him.
"Give me your address," I said. "I'm coming to get you." "I don't think you should," he said quietly. I don't think I'm the person you remember. I don't remember being him. I'm just someone who's been living on the streets for longer than I can recall. I probably smell bad. I probably look scary. I just wanted to call because I thought someone should know that maybe I didn't die in that crash, that maybe there was a mistake. "Tell me where you are," I said firmly. "Right now." He gave me the address of a shelter on South Jackson Street. I wrote it down with shaking hands. It was a 6-hour drive from Portland to Seattle, longer if the traffic was bad. I looked at the clock, 1:17 a.m. "Stay there," I said. "Don't go anywhere. I'm leaving right now. I'll be there by 8 o'clock at the latest. Do you understand? Don't leave." "Okay," he said softly. "Okay, Clara. I'll wait." The line went dead. I sat there in the darkness of my bedroom for maybe 30 seconds, trying to process what had just happened. Then I was moving, pulling on clothes, grabbing my purse and keys. My sister Janet was staying with me for the week. She stirred in the guest room as I passed. "Clara, what's wrong?" "I have to go to Seattle," I said, and my voice sounded strange, disconnected. "Now, at 1 in the morning." "Clara, what's happened?" I looked at her, this woman who'd held my hand at Miles' funeral, who'd helped me raise Alicia when I couldn't get out of bed for weeks, and I didn't know how to say it. How do you tell someone that the man you buried 2 decades ago just called you on the phone? "I'll explain later," I said. "I have to go. I'm sorry." I was out the door before she could ask any more questions. The drive to Seattle was the longest 6 hours of my life. I kept the radio off because I couldn't stand the noise. My mind was spinning with possibilities, with impossibilities. Part of me was convinced this was a cruel hoax, that I'd get there and find some con artist who'd somehow learn details about Miles's life. But another part of me, the part that had never fully accepted that my husband was gone, was screaming that it was real. I thought about that day at the morgue. I was 41 years old, barely holding myself together, and they'd pulled back the sheet to show me a face that was battered and swollen from the crash. The body had been in the ravine for almost 2 days before they recovered it. There was trauma everywhere, gashes, bruising, the kind of damage that comes from a violent impact. But I'd looked at the build of the body, the color of the hair, the wedding ring on the finger, and I'd said, yes, that's my husband. That's Miles Kane. What if I'd been wrong? What if, in my shock and grief, I'd identified the wrong body? The possibility made me feel sick, because if that was true, then Miles had been alive all this time. Alive and suffering, alone, not knowing who he was. While I had moved forward with my life, while I had helped Alicia graduate high school, watched her get married, held my grandson for the first time, while I'd finally, after 15 years, allowed myself to date someone else. I pressed harder on the accelerator. I reached Seattle at 7:45 in the morning. The city was just waking up, commuters flooding the streets, coffee shops opening their doors. The Rainier district was exactly as rough as I have imagined. Graffiti-tagged buildings, people shuffling along sidewalks with everything they owned in shopping carts, the sharp smell of urine mixing with exhaust fumes. This was where my husband had been living. I found the shelter on South Jackson Street. It was a long brick building that looked like it had been a warehouse once. The front door was propped open with a cinder block. Inside it smelled like disinfectant, trying and failing to mask the scent of too many bodies in too small a space. A young man sat behind a folding table near the entrance. He looked up as I came in, his eyes tired but kind. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone," I said, my voice hoarse from crying during the drive. "His name is..."
He might not remember his name, but he called me early this morning. He said he's been staying here. He would have asked to use a phone around 1 a.m. The young man's expression softened with recognition. Miles. Yeah, I remember. He was pretty shaken up when he asked for the phone, said it was urgent. Nice guy, quiet. He's been coming here off and on for maybe 10 years. Keeps to himself mostly. 10 years. The words hit me like a fist. Is he here now? I asked. Check the dining hall, through that door. He pointed to a set of double doors on the right. I walked toward them, my legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. My hands were trembling. My mouth was dry. Everything in me was screaming that this couldn't be real, that I was walking into some elaborate nightmare. The dining hall was a large room with long tables and benches. There were maybe 20 people scattered around, some eating breakfast, others just sitting with cups of coffee. Most of them looked up as I entered, their eyes guarded. And then I saw him. He was sitting alone at a table near the back, his hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup. His hair was completely gray, longer than Miles had ever worn it, pulled back in a low ponytail. He wore a faded green jacket that hung loose on his thin frame, and his shoulders were hunched forward like he was trying to make himself invisible. I walked toward him slowly, each step feeling like it took a lifetime. Miles? I said. He turned around. The face that looked back at me was nothing like the face I remembered. This man was gaunt, weathered, with deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. His skin was tanned and rough from years of sun and wind. There was a jagged scar running along his jawline that hadn't been there before. He looked 70, not 58. But the eyes, God help me, the eyes were the same, deep brown with flakes of amber that caught the light. The same eyes that had looked at me across the altar 23 years ago. The same eyes that had watched Alicia take her first steps. Clara, he said, and his voice broke on my name. You came. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at this man who might be my husband, this ghost from 20 years ago. He stood up slowly, stiffly, like his body hurt. He was thinner than Miles had been, his clothes hanging off him. But when he looked at me, really looked at me, there was something in his expression, recognition, longing, fear, that made my breath catch in my throat. I wasn't sure you'd really come, he said quietly. I thought maybe I'd dreamed it, that I'd made the whole call up. Show me your hand, I said. My voice came out harsh, demanding, but I couldn't help it. I needed proof. The right one. He hesitated for just a moment, then held out his right hand, palm up. There, running across the palm and down to his wrist, was a scar. Old, faded to white, but unmistakable. The same scar from the garage door, the same scar I'd kissed 1,000 times. My knees buckled. I grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. The room tilted, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. I think you should sit down, he said, and suddenly he was there, guiding me into a chair, his hands, those scarred, weathered hands, steadying me. I sat down hard, my breath coming in short gasps. He sat across from me, watching me with those eyes, Miles' eyes, waiting. We sat there in that sheltered dining hall for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Neither of us knew what to say. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 20 years of loss and confusion and impossible hope. Around us, life continued. People shuffled past with trays of food. Someone laughed at a television in the corner. A baby cried somewhere in the distance. But in our little bubble at that table, the world had stopped turning. Finally, I found my voice. Tell me about the crash, I said. Tell me what you remember. He looked down at his hands, turning them over slowly like he'd never seen them before. They were covered in calluses and scars, the hands of someone who'd done brutal labor for years. I don't remember the crash itself, he said quietly, but I have nightmares, always the same. I'm driving and it's raining so hard I can barely see, and the road is slick and I'm trying to brake, but the car won't stop. And then I'm falling, just falling through darkness. And it's so cold. So cold, I think I'm dying from it. And then nothing, just emptiness for a long time. He rubbed his face with both hands, and I noticed how thin his fingers were, how the bones stood out. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up in a hospital. A doctor told me I'd been brought in from the streets, that someone had found me unconscious near the waterfront. They said I'd been beaten badly, that I had head trauma, but I didn't remember any of it. I couldn't remember anything. Not my name, not where I was from, nothing. What year was this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 2010, he said. March, I think. I didn't even know what year it was at first. I had to ask the nurses. 2010. 5 years after the crash. My mind reeled. What had happened in those 5 years? Where had Miles been? And before that, you really don't remember anything between the crash and 2010? He shook his head slowly. Sometimes I get flashes, little pieces that don't quite fit together. I remember being in the woods, mountains maybe, cold all the time. And I remember working, hard physical work, moving things, building things. But it's all foggy, like trying to see through thick smoke. For a long time, I didn't even try to remember, he said, his voice dropping. I just survived, day by day. Found shelters when I could, slept in doorways when I couldn't, picked up work here and there, day labor, cash jobs. There are whole months I can't account for, weeks where I don't know where I was or what I did. I felt tears burning behind my eyes again. This man, this broken man sitting across from me had been out there all this time, alone, lost, while I've been living my life, raising our daughter, moving forward. When did you start trying to remember? I asked. About 6 months ago, he said. There's a woman who volunteers here, Mrs. Chen. She was sorting through old newspapers for recycling, and she showed me one from November 2005. Said, "Can you believe this was 20 years ago?" And something about that date, he paused, swallowing hard. Something about it felt important, like it meant something. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of newspaper, carefully folded and refolded so many times, the creases were nearly torn through. He unfolded it gently and pushed it across the table to me. It was a news article about the crash. 5 dead in Cliffside Pass tragedy, the headline read, and there, in a small grid of photos, was Miles's face. Young, smiling, a photo from our wedding day that I'd given to the newspaper. My hand trembled as I picked it up. I looked at that picture for hours, he said softly, and something inside me recognized it. Not from a mirror, I don't look anything like that anymore, but from somewhere deeper. And the name underneath, Miles Kane. I kept saying it over and over, Miles, and it felt right. It felt like my name. Then last week, he said, his voice breaking completely now, I found something else. I was sorting through my things. I don't have much, just a backpack with some clothes and a few odds and ends I've picked up over the years. And at the very bottom, wrapped in an old t-shirt, I found a wallet. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a battered brown leather wallet, cracked and worn with age. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside, tucked into a clear plastic sleeve, was a photograph. He slid it across the table to me. I picked it up, and my world shattered all over again. It was us. Me and Alicia. She was maybe 4 years old in the photo, sitting on my lap on our back porch,
both of us laughing at something off camera. I was younger. My hair was still dark brown, my face unlined. Alicia's curls were wild around her face, and she was missing one of her front teeth.
I remembered this photo. Miles had taken it on a Sunday morning in early summer. We'd been making pancakes, and Alicia had gotten syrup everywhere, and we'd all dissolved into giggles. He'd grabbed the camera and captured that moment of pure joy. I flipped it over with trembling fingers. On the back, in my own handwriting, faded but still legible, it said, "Clara and Alicia Kane, summer 2004. Our girls. Love you forever." Our girls. That's what Miles used to call us. His girls. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my vision blurring with tears. "I looked at that photo," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "and I knew I'd seen those faces in my dreams. That little girl, she's the one I dream about. The one who sings, the one who used to sit on my shoulders. I don't remember it clearly, but I feel it here." He pressed his hand to his chest. "I feel it in my heart." "She's 25 now," I managed to say through my tears. "She's married. She has a baby, a little boy named Owen." His face crumpled. "I missed it all. I missed everything." "You didn't miss it by choice," I said firmly, reaching across the table to grip his scarred hand. "You didn't leave us. You didn't abandon us. Something happened to you, something terrible, and you survived it. That's what matters." "But I should have found you sooner. I should have tried harder to remember." "You couldn't," I said. "You were hurt. Your brain was damaged. You did the best you could." He nodded, but I could see he didn't quite believe it. The guilt was written all over his weathered face. We sat there for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, the photo between us. Finally, I took a deep breath and made a decision. "We need to do a DNA test," I said. "I need to know for certain, not because I don't believe you," I squeezed his hand tighter, "but because I need proof, scientific proof. Because if you're really Miles, if you're really my husband, then we need to figure out what happened. We need answers." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I want to know too. I need to know." I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and started searching. There had to be somewhere in Seattle that could do DNA testing quickly, somewhere that could give us answers. I found a private lab in downtown Seattle that offered expedited testing. They could have results in 48 hours. It was expensive, but I didn't care. I would have paid anything. I called them right there, explained the situation in the vaguest terms possible, and made an appointment for 3 o'clock that afternoon. "Come on," I said, standing up. "Let's go get this done." He stood too, moving stiffly like his joints hurt. I noticed how much shorter he seemed than Miles had been. Miles was almost 6 feet tall. This man seemed smaller, hunched, diminished. But then years of malnutrition and living rough could do that to a person, could literally shrink them. As we walked out of the shelter together, I was hyper-aware of him beside me, the way he moved carefully like he expected the ground to give way beneath him, the way he kept his head down, trying not to draw attention, the way his hand shook slightly when he reached for the door. This was my husband. Or he might be. And either way, my life would never be the same. The DNA lab was in a sleek downtown building that felt like another world compared to the shelter we'd just left. Clean white walls, soft music playing, the receptionist greeting us with a professional smile that faltered slightly when she took in Miles' appearance. The worn jacket, the weathered face, the way he kept his eyes down. I filled out the paperwork while Miles sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped between his knees. When they called us back, a technician in blue scrubs explained the process. 2 cheek swabs each. Simple, quick, results in 48 hours. "We're testing for spousal relationship?" she asked, glancing between us. "Yes," I said firmly. "My husband was declared dead 20 years ago. We need to confirm his identity." If she thought it was strange she didn't show it, she probably had seen stranger things. The swabs took less than 5 minutes. The technician labeled them carefully, had us sign more forms, and then we were done. 48 hours. 2 days to find out if the impossible was real.
Outside, the afternoon sun was bright, almost blinding after the dim shelter. Miles squinted against it, raising one hand to shade his eyes. "What now?" he asked quietly. "Now we get you somewhere safe," I said. "There's a hotel near Pike Place Market. We'll stay there while we wait for the results." "Clara, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," I interrupted. "I'm not leaving you at that shelter. Not now. Not after everything." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he was too tired, too overwhelmed. He just nodded. The hotel was modest but clean, and I paid cash for a room with 2 double beds. The desk clerk barely glanced at us as he handed over the key cards. In the elevator, Miles stood as far from me as possible, like he was afraid of contaminating me somehow. The room was simple: cream-colored walls, dark blue bedspreads, a view of the street below. Miles stood in the doorway for a moment, just staring at it like he'd never seen a hotel room before. Maybe he hadn't. Not in 20 years. "Go ahead and shower," I said gently. "Take your time. I'll order some food." He nodded, gathering the small plastic bag of toiletries I'd bought at a drugstore on the way. Soap, shampoo, a toothbrush, deodorant. Basic things. Things he hadn't had in God knew how long. The bathroom door closed behind him, and a moment later I heard the water start. I sat on the edge of one bed, suddenly exhausted. My hands were still shaking, my mind was still reeling. Through the frosted glass of the bathroom door, I could see his silhouette. He moved slowly, carefully, like even this simple act of showering was overwhelming. I could see how thin he was, ribs visible even through the distorted glass. Shoulders sharp and bony. This man had been starving for years, living on the edge of survival. He stayed in there for almost an hour. I didn't rush him. I just sat on the bed and stared at the wall, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. When he finally emerged, wearing the cheap sweatpants and t-shirt I'd bought him from a drugstore on the way, his hair was wet and slicked back from his face. He'd shaved off the patchy beard with the disposable razor I'd gotten him. And suddenly, I could see it more clearly. The curve of his jaw, the shape of his mouth, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners even when he wasn't smiling. It was Miles. Older, damaged, changed, but Miles. "Better?" I asked softly. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you for all of this." "Don't thank me. Just sit down. I ordered Chinese food. Should be here soon." We ate in near silence when the food arrived, both of us too overwhelmed to make conversation. I watched him eat slowly, carefully, like he wasn't used to having this much food. He kept glancing at me like he expected me to change my mind, to tell me this was all a mistake. Finally, as we were finishing, he set down his chopsticks and looked at me. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Anything." "What was I like before?" His voice cracked on the last word. "I need to know. I need to know who I was." The tears came instantly, hot and overwhelming. I set down my own food and took a shaky breath. "You were kind. Kind, it almost hurt sometimes. You picked up every injured animal you found. You always gave money to homeless people, even when we were broke ourselves." He was crying too now, silent tears streaming down his weathered face. "You laughed too loud, at movies, at stupid jokes, at Alicia's silly songs. You burnt toast every single morning, but swore it tasted better that way. You sang off key in the shower, you left your socks on the floor, you fell asleep during every movie we watched together." I was sobbing now, the words pouring out.
But most of all, you loved us. God, Miles, you loved us so much. Every morning you'd kiss Alicia's forehead and tell her she was your sunshine. Every night you'd pull me close and say, I'm the luckiest man alive. You were our whole world.
He reached across the small table and took my hand, and we sat there crying together while the food grew cold between us. The next day passed in a blur. We didn't leave the hotel room. We just existed together in that small space, talking in fragments, sharing memories, mine vivid and real, his hazy and uncertain. He told me more about his years on the streets. I told him about raising Alicia alone, about the grief support groups, about the day I finally boxed up his clothes. That night, neither of us slept much. I lay in my bed listening to him breathe in the darkness, the stranger who might be my husband. At 2:30 the next afternoon, my phone rang. The lab. My hands shook so badly I could barely answer it. Mrs. Kane, this is Dr. Martinez from the lab. I'm calling with your DNA results. I put the phone on speaker so Miles could hear. He sat forward on his bed, his face pale. The probability of spousal relationship between Clara Kane and the tested male is 99.97%. That's consistent with biological relationship between husband and wife. There's no doubt. Genetically speaking, this man is Miles Kane. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor. The room tilted. Everything went white at the edges. Miles reached for me, his hand shaking as badly as mine, and pulled me toward him. I collapsed against his chest and we held each other as 20 years of impossible grief and impossible hope crashed together into one impossible truth. It's you, I sobbed into his shoulder. You're really him. You're my husband. I'm your husband, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm Miles. I'm home. Dr. Evelyn Ward's office was nothing like the sterile lab where we'd gotten the DNA results. It was warm, filled with soft lighting and comfortable chairs, books lining the walls. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering to ever judge. I had found her through a crisis counselor at the hospital. She specializes in trauma cases, the counselor had told me, particularly amnesia and dissociative disorders. If anyone can help you understand what happened, it's Dr. Ward. Now we sat across from her, Miles and me side by side on the leather couch while she listened, really listened, in a way that made you feel like every word mattered, and told her everything, the crash, the body I had identified, the funeral, 20 years of grief, the phone call, the DNA test. Miles filled in what he could remember, the fragments, the nightmares, the missing years. Dr. Ward took notes, asked careful questions, her expression growing more somber as we spoke. When we finished, she set down her pen and looked at Miles with deep compassion. I'd like to examine you, if that's all right, she said gently. Just a basic physical assessment, to see what we're working with. Miles nodded, and she guided him to an examination area separated by a curtain. I heard her voice, soft and patient, asking him questions, telling him what she was doing. After about 20 minutes, they returned. Dr. Ward's face was troubled. You have extensive evidence of old trauma, she said to Miles. Multiple healed fractures, ribs, your left arm, your right ankle, significant scarring on your torso and back, consistent with repeated injuries over time. And there's a depression here. She touched the back of his head gently. Consistent with severe head trauma, a blow or impact that would have caused significant brain injury. From the crash? I asked, my voice tight. Possibly, Dr. Ward said, but let me tell you what I think happened, based on everything you've told me and what I'm seeing. She leaned forward, her hands clasped. I think Miles did survive the initial crash, but he was badly injured. Severe head trauma, possibly unconscious. In the chaos, the darkness, the snow, the confusion, he was likely thrown from the vehicle or wandered away in a state of shock. The other survivors were focused on their own injuries, on the people they could see. In conditions like that, it would be easy for someone to go unaccounted for.
My stomach twisted. So he was just left there? Not intentionally, but in the aftermath of a major accident, especially in bad weather, in the dark, people get missed, especially if they wandered away from the main wreckage. She turned to Miles. I think someone found you. Maybe a trucker passing by? Maybe someone from one of the small towns along that highway. Someone who didn't take you to a hospital. Why wouldn't they? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Because they saw an opportunity, Dr. Ward said quietly. A young man with no memory, no ID, no ability to identify himself or ask for help. Men like that are valuable to certain people. There are operations in remote areas, illegal logging camps, construction sites, agricultural operations that use workers who won't ask questions, who can't ask questions, who have nowhere to go. The room seemed to shrink. I felt sick. You think someone kept him? I said, my voice hollow. Like a slave? I think someone exploited him, Dr. Ward said carefully, for years, probably 5 years based on your timeline. Hard physical labor, minimal food, no medical care. It would explain the healed fractures, the scarring, the premature aging. Your body shows signs of chronic malnutrition and repeated injury, Miles. Miles was staring at his hands, tears sliding down his weathered face. I'd tried to remember. Every winter when it got cold, I'd have these dreams. A red house with white trim, a little girl with curls singing, "You Are My Sunshine," over and over. And I'd wake up crying, but I thought it was just a dream, just something my broken brain made up. I grabbed his hand, squeezing tight. It wasn't a dream. That was our house. That was Alicia. She sang that song every night before bed. You used to sing it with her. It was real, he whispered, looking at me with devastated eyes. All this time, it was real. Your mind was trying to find its way home, Dr. Ward said softly. Even through the trauma, through everything you endured, part of you remembered. Part of you knew you belonged somewhere else. She paused, giving us a moment. Around 2010, something changed. Either you escaped, or they decided you were more trouble than you were worth. Years of hard labor would age anyone significantly. If you were starting to have serious medical problems, cognitive issues, they might have simply dumped you, left you in a city where you'd blend in with the other homeless population. And then I just survived, Miles said, for another 15 years, on the streets. While Clara was, his voice broke, while I was in Portland, while I could have been home. You couldn't have known, I said fiercely, turning to face him. Your brain was damaged. Your memories were gone. You did the only thing you could do. You survived. But I could see the guilt eating him alive, and I felt my own guilt rising to match it. For 20 years, he'd been alive, suffering, alone, and I'd never looked for him because I'd been so certain he was dead. The drive back to Portland felt both endless and too short. Miles sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing landscape like he was trying to memorize every detail. His hands were clasped in his lap, trembling slightly. She might not believe it, he said quietly, as we crossed the Columbia River. Even with the DNA test, she might not want to believe it. She will, I said, though my own heart was hammering with uncertainty. She has to. I'd called Alicia the night before, after Dr. Ward's assessment, told her everything. The DNA results, the trauma specialist theory, the 20 years of missing life. She'd been silent for a long time on the other end of the line. Finally, she'd said, "I need to see him, Mom. I need to see him with my own eyes." Now, as I pulled into our driveway, the house Miles and I had bought together 30 years ago, the house where we'd raised Alicia, I saw her waiting on the porch. She stood with her arms crossed, her dark hair pulled back, her face unreadable. She looked so much like Miles, it made my chest ache. I put the car in park, but neither of us moved for a moment. "That's her," Miles whispered, his voice breaking. "That's Alicia." "That's your daughter," I confirmed. He opened the door with shaking hands and stepped out slowly. I came around to stand beside him, and together we walked up the path to the porch.
Alicia's eyes tracked every movement, scanning Miles from head to toe. I could see her taking in the gray hair, the weathered skin, the way he moved like an old man despite being only 58. She looked for traces of the father she barely remembered, the father from photographs and faded memories. "Mom, this can't be real," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "He's been dead for 20 years. We buried him. I was at the funeral." "I know, baby," I said softly. "But it's him. The DNA test proved it. It's your father." Miles took a hesitant step forward, and I saw Alicia flinch slightly. He stopped immediately, like he was afraid of frightening her. "Alicia," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "I know I look different. I know this is impossible, but I swear to you, I'm your dad. I'm Miles Keene. I'm so sorry I've been gone." Alicia's eyes filled with tears. She stared at him, her jaw clenched, fighting to maintain control. Then her gaze dropped to his hands. "Show me your right hand," she said suddenly. Miles held it out without hesitation. The scar was clearly visible across his palm, white and raised against his weathered skin. I saw recognition flash across Alicia's face. I told her about that scar 100 times growing up. The story of how Daddy had cut his hand fixing the garage door, how he'd bled all over the kitchen, how brave he'd been getting stitches. "I remember that story," she whispered. "Mom told me. You were fixing the garage door and the spring snapped and you caught it with your bare hand." "I don't remember it," Miles said quietly, "but the scar is there. It's always been there." Alicia took a step closer, then another. She reached out and touched the scar gently, tracing it with her finger. Miles stood perfectly still, tears streaming down his face. "You have his eyes," Alicia said, looking up at him. His eyes. The same brown with the gold flecks. I've seen them in every photo." "You have them too," Miles said softly. "You have your father's eyes." Something broke in Alicia then. A sound escaped her throat, half sob, half gasp, and suddenly she was launching herself forward, throwing her arms around him. Miles caught her, his thin arms wrapping around his daughter for the first time in 20 years. They clung to each other on the porch, both sobbing. Alicia's words came out in a broken rush. "You missed everything. You missed my entire life. My graduation, high school and college, my wedding, my baby. Owen is 7 months old and you've never even met him. You missed everything, Dad. Everything." "I know," he choked out, his face buried in her hair. "I know, sweetheart, and I'm so, so sorry." "Where were you?" she cried into his shoulder. "Where were you all this time?" "I don't know," he said, his voice breaking completely. "I don't remember, but I never stopped loving you. Even when I didn't know who I was, even when I didn't remember your name, I dreamed about you. A little girl singing. I dreamed about you every night." Alicia pulled back slightly, her hands gripping his arms, her eyes searching his face. "You really don't remember me? Growing up? Being my dad?" "Not clearly."
Miles admitted, fresh tears falling. Just feelings, just dreams. But I know you're mine. I knew it the moment I saw that photograph. I knew you were my daughter. I'm your daughter, Alicia repeated, like she was trying to convince herself. And you're alive. You're really alive. I'm alive. And I'm home. If you'll let me be. Alicia looked at me over his shoulder, her face a mess of tears and confusion and desperate hope. I nodded, tears streaming down my own face. She turned back to Miles and hugged him again, tighter this time. "Welcome home, Dad," she whispered. "Welcome home." 3 months later, our house felt different. Not quite whole, but healing, like a bone that had been broken and was slowly knitting itself back together. Miles had his own room, the guest room downstairs, because some nights the nightmares were too much, and he needed space to break down without feeling like he was burdening me. Dr. Ward said it was healthy, that we were essentially strangers learning to be spouses again, and we needed to give each other grace.
He attended therapy twice a week. Sometimes he came home quiet and withdrawn. Other times, he came home with a fragment of memory restored. A flash of our wedding day, the smell of my perfume, the sound of rain on our old roof. Each recovered piece felt like a small miracle. The hardest moments were when Alicia visited with Owen. Miles would hold his grandson with trembling hands, tears streaming down his weathered face, mourning all the moments he'd missed. But Owen didn't see a stranger. He saw a gentleman who spoke softly and held him carefully, and that was enough. Gampa, Owen had started calling him last week. Miles had wept for an hour. This evening I was cooking dinner. Shepherd's pie, the meal Miles used to request every year on his birthday. I didn't know if he'd remember it, but I had to try. The kitchen filled with the rich smell of beef and herbs, and I saw Miles pause in the doorway, his eyes distant. "That smell," he said quietly. "I know that smell." "Shepherd's pie," I said, my heart racing. "Your favorite?" He closed his eyes, and I saw him searching his fractured memory. "My birthday," he whispered. "You always made it on my birthday." I had to grip the counter to keep from breaking down. Yes, I did." When Alicia arrived with Owen, we all sat around the table together. It still felt surreal, this family that had been shattered and somehow reassembled, different but intact. Miles held Owen on his lap while we ate, the baby grabbing at his grandfather's weathered hands. Alicia watched them, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "He has your eyes," Miles said suddenly, looking down at Owen. "Clara's eyes, the same green." "No," I said softly, smiling through my own tears. "He has yours, brown with gold flecks, just like his grandfather, just like his mother." Outside, rain began to tap against the windows, gentle, steady, the kind of rain that had always made me think of Miles, the kind of rain that had been falling the night of the crash 20 years ago, the night the world ended and began again. After dinner, as I cleared the dishes, I watched Miles on the floor with Owen, carefully stacking blocks, while Alicia told him stories about her childhood, filling in the gaps his memory couldn't reach. He listened like each word was precious, like he was trying to memorize the life he'd missed. I caught his eye across the room, and he gave me a small, fragile smile. Later, after Alicia had taken Owen home, after we'd cleaned up and the house had grown quiet, Miles stood by the window watching the rain. I came to stand beside him. "Welcome home, Miles," I whispered. He turned to look at me, and in the dim light, I could almost see the young man I'd married, not in his face,
That was too changed, too weathered by suffering. But in his eyes, in the way he looked at me like he was his whole world. "I never left," he said softly. "I just got lost on the way." I took his scarred hand in mine, and we stood there together, watching the rain fall on the house that had waited 20 years for him to come home. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more nightmares, more therapy sessions, more moments of grief for the years we'd lost. We would have to learn to be husband and wife again, to navigate the space between who we'd been and who we'd become. But we would do it together. Because love, I'd learned, doesn't end with death. It doesn't end with time or distance or even memory loss. It endures. It survives. It finds its way home even through 20 years of darkness. Miles was home, and that was everything.